The delineation of comic book history into specific ages is intrinsically tied to the superhero genre. This mainly occurs because that genre is directly associated with comic books. After all, it was the creation of superheroes that made a new medium unique and distinct from its newspaper origins. Of course, superheroes haven't always been the dominant genre, but they have been a steady presence since the very beginning of the medium. So it's no surprise that notable events in superhero history are what begins certain comic book ages. These are somewhat arbitrary points, but there is a reasoning behind them. There are other influential events that directly or indirectly affected the evolution of comic books from a primarily juvenile medium to its current state as a respectable method of artistic expression. Instead of focusing on one genre and its impact, this will contain many of the notable or significant developments of the medium. The main characteristic of this period is the creation of the comic book format. Prior to this, in the early 20th century, the medium was developing. Generally speaking, early comics were satirical pictorials with sequential panels. This eventually transformed into the recognizable newspaper strip format. These newspaper strips were eventually collected and published in a tabloid format that would become comic books. Originally, these tabloid compilations were inserted into newspapers and given away for free. The first collection that was sold on its own was Famous Funnies from 1933. This is usually recognized as the first actual comic book. It contained reprinted newspaper strips and some original material. Again, it was preceded by many other similarly formatted tabloids, but this comic is distinguished by the fact that it was sold separately as opposed to being a newspaper insert. The first comic book with all original material was New Fun Comics No. 1 from 1935. This comic was the first comic published by National Periodicals, the company that would eventually become known as DC. Of all the ages, the beginning of this age is indisputable. It begins with the publication of Action Comics No. 1 in 1938. The significance of this comic is known by anyone who knows anything about comic books. This is the first appearance of Superman. More importantly, it created an entirely new genre, superheroics. Certainly, prior to this, there were individuals with uncanny abilities, Doc Savage and the Shadow being easy examples. At first, the difference between uncanny abilities and superheroics may seem like splitting hairs, and that would be a fair assessment. After all, Superman was just very strong, impervious to bullets, and he could jump large distances. In time, though, the differences would become more pronounced. More to the point, Superman inspired the creation of other heroes with equally super abilities. This character inspired others to elaborate on the concept of extraordinary, fantastical powers. To begin with, there are a few defining features of this age. It was an entirely new medium where anything was possible. As such, there was no language, so to speak. This aspect would develop over the next decade, and it would be refined in the decades that followed. Page layouts and panel arrangements would be integrated with words and individual illustrations to form a cohesive narrative technique. The work done by the Will Eisner and Jerry Iger studio is usually cited as an example of this language developing, as is the work produced by Jack Kirby and Joe Simon. Although one cannot overlook the work of Osamu Tezuka, the prolific manga artist best known for creating Astro Boy. His work would influence many creators worldwide. Another feature was a proliferation of genres. Everything popular on the radio or in the movies became represented in the new medium. It was a visual explosion of variety and diversification. Horror, romance, crime, funny animals, western, and war. Following the end of World War II, superheroes began to fall out of fashion. Other genres, especially crime and horror, soared in popularity. The most popular crime comic, Crime Does Not Pay, boasted a circulation of 2 million copies monthly, which didn't mean they sold 2 million copies. It meant that 2 million people read each issue. Its actual sales were roughly 1.5 million copies monthly. This is a number that's on par with the best-selling superhero titles like Superman and Captain Marvel during the early 40s. Anecdotally, Crime Does Not Pay had a sell-through rate of 100%. Whatever they printed got sold, even if it was a misprinted or damaged copy. In contrast, most best-selling titles had a sell-through rate between roughly 65 and 80%. Whether those numbers are accurate or not is unknown. Regardless, crime comics did very well. The Golden Age was an innocent time in some respects. The end of its innocence was when the medium was codified as strictly juvenile entertainment. This was initiated by the publication of Seduction of the Innocent in 1954. The unfounded accusations and the sloppy, intentionally misleading conclusions proposed by Dr. Wortham were popularly accepted and endorsed. Hysteria ensued. The result being, the medium was infantilized and heavily censored for the next 2 decades. Significantly, the censorship board, the Comics Code Authority, was established. The mandate of this board was to ensure comic books remained a sanitary form of entertainment for children. To that end, if a comic didn't meet their standards and receive their approval, distributors wouldn't ship the comic to newsstands. The 2 genres that were specifically targeted were horror and crime. The restrictions placed on those 2 genres essentially ensured they wouldn't receive Comics Code approval. As a result, these genres were neutered and their appeal rapidly diminished. To give one a sense of the impact the Comics Code had on the industry, prior to the code, there were roughly 20 comic book publishers. Within the first few years of the code being implemented, that number dropped to 8. The most notable casualty was EC, Entertaining Comics. This company produced some of the most challenging, thought-provoking material during its brief existence. EC had a quality that was consistent and noticeably different than all other contemporary publishers. When the Comics Code was drafted, the publisher, Max Gaines Jr., claimed the restrictions were specifically targeted at EC in an effort to neutralize and destroy the publisher. At a glance, this accusation appears to have some truth. Regardless, EC was unable to make the change to more sanitary comic book material. However, by utilizing the magazine format, which was outside the purview of the Comics Code, EC transformed into the highly successful publisher of Mad Magazine. The consensus concerning the beginning of the Silver Age is the publication of Showcase No. 4 in October 1956. This issue introduced the modern Barry Allen version of The Flash. The reasoning behind this demarcation point is, a Golden Age character was repurposed for a modern audience. Reportedly, it was the first popular superhero concept since, roughly, the 1940s. In other words, The Flash proved the public was still interested in superheroes. Objectively, the beginning of the Silver Age should be the publication of Fantastic Four No. 1 in 1961. The obvious impact of this comic far exceeds the impact of Showcase No. 4. One could make a reasonably strong case for the brave and bold No. 28, the first appearance of the Justice League of America. Like The Flash, this was a repurposed concept from the Golden Age, one that also proved to be quite successful, and its success directly led to the creation of the Fantastic Four. However, logically, without the publication of The Flash first, the Justice League might not have been published. And the Fantastic Four might never existed, since they were allegedly created to capitalize on the Justice League's success. So the reintroduction of The Flash started a chain of events that led to superheroes flourishing once again. Historically speaking, the Silver Age is the new age of superheroes. The genre once again became relevant, and it took a small step forward into maturity. Again, this is heavily personified by the newly established Marvel Comics. Instead of creating stories for children, Marvel aimed for teenagers. Overall, Marvel added a layer of realism or relatability to their characters. Or, to quote Stan Lee, the only actual employee of Marvel Comics in 1961, these were heroes with feet of clay. They may have performed incredible feats, but at the end of the day, they were also very human. This feature, superpowers, and a recognizable character trait or flaw would be the standard approach for all Marvel characters. To quote former Marvel editor Mark Gruenwald, Marvel Comics were 10% more realistic than DC. That was their appeal. Marvel was just as sensational and dynamic as DC, but the characters and situations felt more real. Whereas, DC characters were basically superpowered in all aspects of their life. They were too perfect. The 60s also gave rise to underground comics. While there had been intermittent adult material, especially in counterculture magazines, the publication of Zap No. 1 in 1968 was a touchstone moment. For whatever reason, this comic galvanized the movement and inspired a variety of underground comic book publishers to emerge. While undergrounds are essentially extinct today, the creative freedom they personified is still alive and well in traditional and non-traditional publishing platforms. One slightly overlooked aspect of the Silver Age is the early beginnings of alternative comics. Marvel and DC were mainstream, producing content for a primarily young audience. The undergrounds were on the other side of that spectrum, with content that was adult, and, at times, controversial due to its depiction of sex, violence, and drug use. Alternative comics sat somewhere between these two extremes. In other words, alternative comics were adult-themed, but they contained a certain level of restraint. Unfortunately, there was no distribution model in place for content of this nature, and these early efforts, primarily by the writer/artist Wally Wood, gained no traction. In a similar alternative comics vein, there was the output of Warren Publishing. Using the loophole pioneered by Mad Magazine, Warren produced horror magazines that were exempt from the restrictions of the Comics Code. They also had widespread mainstream distribution, like Marvel and DC. However, Warren did struggle in its early years. The creation of the campy hostess, Vampirella, in 1969 gave the publisher some notoriety, and the company would have a consistent presence through the next decade. Oh hello, how are you? I know it's been a while since I've rambled at the end of one of these videos, but I wanted to take a moment to mention that this is the first of 3 videos looking at the comic book ages. I was going to do just one massive video, but well, editing it together was taking a lot longer than anticipated. I decided to break it up into 3 pieces so I'd have something for you fine people to view every week. The next 2 parts are completely written, and each one will be about as long as this one. Hopefully I can get both out over the next week or 2. Then I'll compile it all together in one video as originally intended. Since I have your attention, if you're new to this channel, then subscribe. That would be very cool. If you're not new, then consider becoming a member. Or if you're so inclined, maybe donate using the thanks link below this video. Everything helps, and quite honestly, I could really use the support at this time. So, thank you in advance. Alright, back to the grind. I'll talk at you soon.